This is an architecturally unusual castle, an imposing stone pile that grew and grew over time.
Always building something bigger on something that was already very big resulted in this 35,000 square meter structure, the largest castle in Europe.
The size of 7 football pitches, Sedan Castle grew to gigantic proportions by building on pre-existing structures.
Things were not destroyed, but encased, enlarged.
So what we see with Sedan, it's almost like Russian dolls.
Ever practical, the builders erected new walls in front of old walls to create this huge multi-layered stone structure.
The defensive walls became twice, 3 times, 5 times as thick.
Are reinforced, sometimes up to 25 meters wide.
You had these huge masses that were virtually impossible to destroy.
Originally modest in size, Sedan Castle was expanded over the centuries to deter enemy attacks.
Sedan Castle is state-of-the-art. You don't touch it.
In the 16th century, new structures were added to the castle, bastions, and Sedan even became a cutting-edge stronghold.
A whole range of different bastions were tried out here and then adopted elsewhere in Europe.
Situated close to Belgium and Germany, the castle has been on the path of 3 major conflicts, including the Franco-Prussian War of 1870.
Sedan became the witness of the debacle of the war and of Imperial France.
During the First World War, Sedan and its castle took another battering.
The castle became Sedan labor camp.
It was essentially a kind of concentration camp.
Why, despite the lessons of previous wars, was Sedan a crossing point once again? This time for the German army in 1940.
The Germans knew that Sedan and the surrounding area were poorly defended.
Simply cut from rock, the old castle escaped the bombings of World War II. After surviving virtually unscathed for 6 centuries, it was voted France's favorite monument in 2023. Thanks to 3D animation, by looking at how its architecture evolved, we're going to tell you the story of a modest building that became a stone behemoth. A remarkable monument with a unique history, Sedan Castle. "250 kilometers from Paris, in northeastern France, Sedan Castle occupies a very strategic location. Just 15 kilometers from Belgium and 150 kilometers from Germany. It came into being in the Middle Ages on the banks of a 900-kilometer-long river.
It's strategic because of its location. It is on this vitally important river, the Meuse, which connects France, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, all the way up to the North Sea. So by having control of this part of the river, it gives political influence, but also economic control of this vitally important region.
At the time, the Meuse was practically the highway of the Middle Ages in the region.
The castle was built on an outcrop of rock, hence its quirky shape. From the princely chapel at the top, down to the damp cellars where the soldiers lodged, it is a spectacular maze of stone, as well as quite an astonishing combination of styles.
What can seem very surprising is that you have this castle perched on a rocky outcrop, which is essentially medieval.
But then it becomes a 17th century citadel and eventually barracks for armies in the 19th century. When you look at how the castle has evolved across the centuries, it's like a textbook on how military needs have changed.
The most visited monument in the department of the Ardennes, the castle is celebrating its 600th anniversary, officially at least. Because the monument still holds many secrets and could well be even older. To discover its mysteries, you need to stop at different points in the castle. Here they are. On the south side of the monument is the most representative part of what was once a medieval castle, as we imagine them, the Twin Towers. Today, at their top, all that remains are the artillery platforms, but originally each of these towers had a roof. They were the most visible part of the first modest-sized castle.
The first castle was nicknamed the Triangular Castle, simply because it had a triangular layout. Each corner had a tower, and one corner even had two towers, the Twin Towers. This was the castle's entrance. These towers were protected by a châtelet, or gatehouse.
It's quite a simple building. You have a church that was presumably already there.
Some say there was a priory at one end of the fortifications, which connected what's now known as the keep, a large, fairly basic tower, to another circular and fairly basic tower.
20 meters in diameter, this tower is the most imposing part of the original castle. Apparently, it never had a roof but a terrace where many men-at-arms would be posted. It stands at the east side, as this is where the main enemy would have approached from.
Sedan Castle is not a plains castle. It isn't exactly a hill castle either. In fact, it overlooks the town and the river Meuse, but it is a castle built on a plateau edge. The main line of attack is the east side, the plateau side.
Around the original triangular castle, on each of its three sides, the builders added two types of moats. Dry on the Ardennes plateau side, and wet for the parts closest to the river.
On the Meuse side and the town side, ditches were dug out of the earth, and thanks to capillary action, they filled with water from the Meuse, while on the other side, where the enemy would attack from, the ditches were dug out of the rock and not the earth.
Half of the castle is exposed, it is vulnerable. So what they do in terms of design is that they have to build incredibly large ditches to defend that side.
They became bigger over time, absolutely gigantic, up to 50 or 60 meters wide and some 40 meters deep. They give the castle its imposing height.
There is a twofold advantage to digging moats out of the rock. You not only protect yourself from attacks, but all the excavated rock can be used to build the castle.
If the rocky outcrop was originally settled, it's because you could see approaching attackers from a distance. And the castle was gradually built by the quarrying of this rock. On the one hand, the rock was excavated. On the other, the castle was built. So it's kind of a balance and inversion. And even today, when you visit Sedan Castle, you have these rock masses that serve as the foundations for the fortifications, but which were also used for the construction of the castle.
So the majority of the building is made from stone, local stone, that has been dug up, carved, worked, and placed in. But there's also a higher quality of stone, dome stone, which is used for some of the surfaces.
For the cut stone, the door frames, the arrow slits, it's a slightly finer, slightly stronger limestone that is found in the area around Sedan.
The first castle was made up of small rubber stones, which meant not much was required in terms of manpower and equipment to build it.
A castle such as Sedan was built using medieval techniques. The power was animal power, human power. So men's arms, mules, wooden hoisting devices. The roofs were made of slate, probably from the start, because there are slate quarries in the Meuse Valley which have been used since the Middle Ages.
Construction of the castle was pretty fast, and in a matter of years, the first castle appeared.
The original castle is very small in comparison. So currently the castle itself is about 35,000 square meters. The original castle was just a seventh of that, around 5,000 square meters.
The first castle may not have been very imposing, but it already had all the features of a fortress able to withstand the attacks typical of the Middle Ages.
In the 1430s, traditional warfare techniques were still in use, so essentially throwing machines, bows and crossbows, obviously. For sieges, there were battering rams, as well as these wooden towers which were wheeled up to the castle walls. Frequent use was made of assault ladders, too. Made entirely of iron, these huge ladders were propped against the defensive walls, enabling groups of men to scale them simultaneously.
To keep the enemy at bay, Sedan's builders added numerous firing positions behind these loopholes or arrow slits, on the wall walk, and on the terraces. Like all castles built from the 12th century onwards, its towers were rounded.
Originally, castles had square towers, so the rounded towers are much better. It means that arrows or cannonballs, things that are being fired at the castle, will ricochet off, but it also means that there aren't these blind spots where the castle is vulnerable, where it can be attacked, burnt.
If the enemy did manage to breach the castle's first line of defense, another defense system could be installed in the event of a siege: hoarding.
As a century medieval castle, Sedan was effective, but there was also the opportunity to put up hoarding. These are sort of wooden structures that sit on stones around a tower, but allow this sort of extra area for soldiers.
The hoarding could be dismantled. The different sections were numbered and stored away. In the event of war, they could be rapidly assembled to defend the castle. These galleries served two purposes. Archers could fire their arrows through the slits.
You can't necessarily get the trajectory you need with an arrow, but if you can just drop vertically stones, then that is a really good way of defending at the last stage as they're getting really close to the castle.
And there's a very interesting system at Sedan. The twin towers have flared bases. Why? Simply so that anything thrown from the top of the towers will rebound horizontally off these bases and hit the enemy square in the face.
There are all sorts of myths and preconceptions about the assault and defense of castles. It is often said those under attack defended themselves with boiling oil. Imagine importing hundreds and hundreds of hectoliters of olive oil in order to boil it to defend yourself. It isn't plausible. Boiling water was used, and buckets of urine. Once heated, urine really stings the eyes. It hurts, it burns. It is very effective too.
If Sedan Castle was equipped to withstand a siege, it was because its strategic location was the envy of many an enemy. And the individual who built these defensive walls was well aware of this.
The first owner of this castle was a Germanic nobleman. He actually acquired the land through marriage.
The first de la Marque married Marie de Bracquemont, who possessed the seigneurie of Sedan. He must have come here very early on and realized there was a hill overlooking the Meuse. There was already a bridge, and that was extremely important. When you have a bridge, you have a toll. It's a steady source of income.
A whole variety of products circulated from Northern Europe to Southern Europe via the Meuse and through Sedan.
There was dried fish, cloth, slate, and most importantly, timber. All the forests in the area were logged, trees were felled, and you had what is known as timber rafting. That is, the felled trees were tied together to make huge rafts up to 40 or 50 meters long, sometimes longer. These rafts were fitted with large tillers, and it meant that all the towns on the banks of the Meuse could buy wood, which was used at the time for something essential: house building.
For the new lord, the castle was not only an economic asset, but a political one too.
Évrard de la Marque became the arbiter in disputes between these two great European powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, and between the Principality of Liège and the Duchy of Burgundy.
Geopolitically, it's very interesting because it is on this border area. And so whoever controls this region potentially can have these powerful connections with the countries that surround it.
Was Lamarck's castle up to such geopolitical challenges? Perhaps not. At the time of its construction, military techniques took a major technological leap. Catapult and ladder assaults began to give way to a far more formidable weapon: the cannon.
These weapons were made of wrought iron, and then little by little bronze was adopted, which meant metal rather than stone cannonballs could be used. They were smaller, but far more destructive.
When the first castle is being constructed, in many ways it's already becoming obsolete because artillery is changing so rapidly at this point. And you're starting to see the evolution of much smaller, lighter cannonballs that can be fired much longer distances, and these can cause immediate destruction to the walls of an original medieval castle.
In the 1450s, 1460s, the first cannons caused so much damage that those under attack surrendered immediately. This marked the end, as we know it, of the medieval castle, where sieges could last weeks, months, or even years.
Was Évrard de Lamarck aware of the defensive limitations of his castle? Did he build it on the cheap? Or, more radically, is the castle older than imagined? For some experts, in the absence of records indicating the date it was constructed, it's an open question.
There is a tower that is about 10 meters in diameter, which is typical of the 13th, even the 14th century, but not of the 15th. When you look at the oldest elements, they seem terribly old-fashioned.
It's highly likely that the castle that we start to see evolving in the 15th century actually has much earlier roots. It is such a strategic location. You'd have thought somebody at that point would have thought to put some sort of structure there.
In the early 1400s, whether it was old or recent was irrelevant. Sedan Castle needed to be modernized, or it would be ripped apart by the first salvo of cannon fire. How could the castle be strengthened? How could it catch up with the latest developments in weaponry and then get ahead of the curve?
Castle architecture is a constant race because the structures themselves take a long time to construct and a lot of money, whereas they're competing with developments in weaponry, which are rapid and happening in order to combat these structures.
On the east side of the castle, there's an astonishing architectural feature: the Great Tower. It is the symbol of a method widely used at Sedan as a means of reinforcement. And the secret of its construction lies just behind these walls and under this roof.
In the original castle, you had the small tower, which is really very small. It was difficult to reinforce it, and so an absolutely marvelous technique was used. The tower was encased. That is, a great tower was built around the small tower, which was left virtually untouched. Passageways were built around it, and gun posts were added. So not only did the tower increase in size, it also increased in effectiveness. The original small tower is 5 meters in diameter, and once the enlargement was completed, you had this great tower 15 meters in diameter.
The walls of the old tower are still visible. Even the small tower's roof frame was preserved and incorporated into the great tower's frame. Builders at the time were particularly pragmatic.
Today, when we're building something, we might want to clear the site, demolish everything that's there, get rid of all the rubble. But you cannot do that in a time where resources are precious, and when there is already something that is useful on the landscape.
There's a medieval saying, a half-destroyed castle is a half-complete. So things were not destroyed, but encased, enlarged.
It's the principle of Russian dolls. It means you can keep pre-existing structures to form a solid mass. When you have 15-meter thick walls, they withstand cannon fire. They're strong.
100 meters from the Great Tower, opposite the Twin Towers, a gun tower was built to reinforce the castle's defense arsenal. It is just underneath here, but is no longer visible, because once again, the Russian doll principle was applied.
This gun tower actually encased a fortified gatehouse, which is at the foot of the Twin Towers. The gun tower is in fact a circular bastion that is remarkable in terms of its size and thickness. It must have had 50 gun posts to fire in all directions, into the moats at chest height. And the gun terrace could take heavy pieces of artillery capable of firing long distances.
Everard de la Marck's descendants set about building an impregnable fortress. And in Robert de la Marck II's time, the castle was extended beyond its original triangular layout. This was also when the walls reached an incredible scale in certain areas.
One of the main ways that they adapt is to widen the walls, to create these walls that are reinforced, sometimes up to 25 meters wide. You would build another wall behind the original one and then fill it full of soil, of rubble.
Massive amounts were used to form a very, very thick cushion, which not only withstood the impact of enemy cannon fire, but it also meant it was possible to fire cannons from huge platforms as their vibrations were absorbed by the soil. The defensive walls became twice, 3 times, 5 times as thick, and so you had these massive walls that were virtually impossible to destroy.
Sedan Castle, which was already a very strong and powerful edifice, is now even stronger.
Huge masses of earth, of stone, on which the artillery pieces rested, and inside of which rooms were built to house soldiers as well as equipment. Everything about the castle gave an impression of strength.
Sedan Castle is not a fairy tale castle. Everything is focused on the military. It's solid. This massive stone, that's what faced the enemy. The idea was to trick the enemy into thinking you were mightier than you actually were. When you see, for instance, the number of firing holes in a castle, you realize there are usually 4 to 5 times more apertures than there were sergeants at arms. The occupants wanted the enemy to think they were numerous. There are cases of castles using figures made of leather to create the impression that they were people all over the castle, when in fact there were very few.
On several occasions, the castle had to scare off enemy troops. In 1521, the Lord of Sedan played with fire. After supporting Charles V, Robert de la Marck then formed an alliance with the French king Francis I. The Holy Roman Emperor sent 35,000 men to lay siege to a number of castles in the area, including Sedan.
When Charles V turned up here at Sedan, the castle found itself in a very difficult situation. With tens of thousands of soldiers attacking it, it seemed unlikely that the fortress would manage to hold out for very long.
They approach Sedan Castle, hoping to take it, hoping to lay siege to it, but they see how strongly defended it is.
We can assume the castle performed its deterrent function because Charles's troops decided to besiege the weaker town of Mézières instead. Sedan Castle, which already had state-of-the-art defenses, was left untouched.
There was no question of resting on laurels, though. The castle continued to grow in size and strength. With new defensive walls, its surface area increased, and a new, more militarily effective entrance was added.
The Twin Towers weren't closed, but were no longer used as the entrance. A new gatehouse was added on the opposite side, a gatehouse fully adapted to artillery fire.
A bridge led from this gatehouse to the residential areas of the city, which was now walled, because, due to the developments in artillery, a castle was no longer sufficient. The entire city had to be fortified.
You had the castle and the city spreading out below it. Because the local inhabitants sought out the shelter of the castle and of the ramparts that one lord of the castle after another built.
Until the 1530s and 1540s, castles were strategically important in war. But from 1540 onwards, towns and cities became the real strongholds.
Why, now that defense was on another scale, did the lords of Sedan continue to alter their castle? Why did their city become a laboratory for military architecture?
Many European engineers came to test the merits of the fortifications. Sedan became a veritable testing ground.
On the south side of the castle, between the Great Tower and the Twin Towers, this building symbolizes Sedan's political success, the Prince's Pavilion. This pavilion turned the castle from a purely military structure into a more comfortable residence. The fact is, a political event changed everything. After 5 generations of Lamarcks at Sedan, the family received the ultimate seal of approval. King Henry II of France recognized Sedan as a principality. Henceforth, the Lamarcks were no longer mere lords, but princes.
With the increased fortunes of the de la Marck family, it's now going from simply being a fortress to being a place where they can display their wealth and their influence. So now the castle isn't just purely there for military concerns, it's also there as a chance to show off.
Now transformed, this building was apparently designed by one of the king's architects. Originally a small cubic pavilion, it was subsequently enlarged and decorated with timbering.
Architectural elements of the Renaissance were added, including engaged pilasters and pediments, features reminiscent of antiquity. They updated and modernized the castle so that they could say, "We princes of Sedan are thoroughly modern too."
Everything was luxurious, extremely luxurious.
The rank of prince was among the most important at the king's court in 16th century France, which was not unified as it is today. But this status came with responsibilities. The princes of Sedan had to defend the kingdom in this region, directly bordering potential enemies.
At this point, the princes of Sedan, the Lamarck family, chose the King of France.
Sedan became a stronghold, crucial for the security of this whole northeastern region of France.
Safeguarding a stronghold and showing teeth. They certainly know how to do that in Sedan. It was part of the tradition of this family, who went by the nickname of the Wild Boars of the Ardennes.
War was in the Lamarck family's genes and, if you ask me, in those of all the subsequent princes of Sedan.
While waging war in Italy alongside the King of France, the Lamarcks heard about a new Italian defense system, bastions.
In the 1600s, the castle at Sedan is provided with 4 bastions on each of the corners of the original structure.
Of these 4 bastions, 2 have been extensively destroyed, but the 2 facing the town are still intact. The Ladies' Bastion is the symbol of Sedan's Russian doll system. Under its masonry, there is the old gun tower, which was itself built around the fortified gatehouse.
The bastions projected outward from the corners of the castle. Although they were modern, they were built using the same techniques as in the past. In other words, stone was taken from the ditches and used as cheap building material.
These bastions were a response to developments in artillery that was now capable of destroying a castle in a matter of days.
As artillery gets increasingly powerful, bastions are created, which is sort of another bigger layer outside of the castle walls. And originally they are triangular in shape, which allows for these broad terraces where people can both fire out from in a number of different directions.
With the bastions, heavy artillery could be used on the platforms for long-range firing, and inside, in the casemates, there was light artillery to protect the immediate vicinity of the fortification.
Thanks to this light artillery, the bastions could protect each other if ever the enemy managed to reach the outer wall.
These bastions were of high quality, and they had very sophisticated ventilation systems, because when a cannon is fired, it releases carbon monoxide. So if you don't clear the air of this carbon monoxide, you die.
With its 4 bastions, Sedan was something of a trailblazer. But this military architecture was starting to become popular all over Europe. Further along the Meuse, 70 kilometers north of Sedan at Givet, Emperor Charles V started work on a bastion citadel at the same time. There were no castles here, but a formidable fort perched on a hill 80 meters above sea level, Fort Chalamont. Once completed, the structure covered 80 hectares and had 10 kilometers of ramparts. That's 20 times larger than Sedan Castle. Europe's rulers had embarked on a frantic race to build the most impregnable fortresses. And Sedan had not yet said its last word.
The city was surrounded by a medieval wall, defended by a number of small gun towers, but this defense system rapidly became obsolete in the 16th century, and so the princes decided to fortify the city as well.
Why did this defense system become obsolete? Simply because cannons became increasingly destructive.
Fortifying the city meant the citizens would be safeguarded, and the first line of defense would be further away from the city.
To keep enemy cannon as far as possible from the city, Sedan embarked on the construction of a huge network of bastions, the first of its kind in Europe.
A whole range of different bastions was tried out here, and then adopted elsewhere in Europe. It took a very long time because it was extremely costly, but the aim was to completely enclose the city with a bastion wall, and this took about 100 years.
For a century, the city of Sedan continually reinforced itself. The network of bastions eventually covered an area of 110 hectares. That's 30 times more than this already imposing castle.
Sedan was a veritable stronghold with a castle, and thanks to this network of bastions all around it, the city became a major border stronghold.
Sedan then enjoyed a great period of prosperity, and the future seemed bright for the principality, even when it changed hands.
Sedan passed out of the Lamarck's hands and came into the possession of the La Tour d'Auvergne family. And they built a new castle below the original. It was actually a magnificent palace.
The Prince's Palace was not designed by just any old architect, but by King Henry IV's architect, Salomon de Brosse, who built some absolutely magnificent buildings such as the Luxembourg Palace in Paris, which he built for the Queen.
Why build a new castle outside Sedan Castle? Because the court life of the princes of Sedan could no longer be conducted in an old fortress that was increasingly military, with a garrison, troops, cannons, and so on.
It's a palace with a huge number of windows, which faces the sun and has many enormous rooms, as well as stables and a carriage park. All of this gave a royal touch to Sedan for the first time.
But everything would suddenly come to an end. After the rise came the fall. How and why did the princes of Sedan relinquish their possessions? And what became of the castle and the stronghold, patiently built over 200 years? The fact is, the small palace was the final milestone in the castle's princely transformation. After this, it became an austere fortress once more, and the symbol of this era stands on the north side of the castle, the Magasin Faber, a purely functional building.
The Magasin Faber, which is now a hotel, is a multi-storied building with tiny windows designed to air the grain stored inside it. The garrison stored its grain in this warehouse, the Magasin Faber. There were thousands of men to feed in Sedan and in the castle.
This garrison was not the principality's garrison, but belonged to the King of France, because in 1642, the last prince of Sedan, Frédéric Maurice de la Tour d'Auvergne, planned one plot too many.
Frédéric Maurice, who was involved in the plot against Louis XIII and, above all, against Cardinal Richelieu, had to cede his lands to France. He saved his head, but lost Sedan.
And as a result, it's taken in by the French state and turned into an army barracks.
It was gradually cleared of its furniture and artworks. Everything disappeared. The place was converted into barrack rooms.
From the moment the castle was considered nothing more than a barracks, all the work done on it was purely of a military nature.
In the 17th century, the castle was visited by a military engineer who would make his mark on the century and on the French landscape. Vauban, Louis XIV's Marshal of France. Tasked with building or improving 100 strongholds all over the country, he was somewhat surprised by Sedan.
So when Vauban is analysing France's border as part of this huge campaign to really properly defend the nation, he goes to Sedan and assesses it. He says it's bizarre, but effective. And interestingly, he doesn't actually need to make many changes to it. The only real change he does is to introduce a new door, the door of the princes.
This opening was not essential for defending the castle because it was not located on the town side and it faced the enemy. Except if the enemy was the population itself.
The castle's purpose was to prevent the city rising up and to shoot the citizens if need be. But it could only fulfill its function as a police fortress against the city if it had the keys to the countryside, meaning those inside could flee or bring in additional troops without the city knowing, to perform its repressive role.
Under Louis XIV, Sedan was incorporated into Vauban's defense system for France, the Pré-Carré, or dueling zone. It was on the second line, but served as a strategic barrier on the northeastern border.
Vauban thought that it was sufficiently well armed to become part of his defense system. Sedan had to become an arsenal, the arsenal of France, on the northern border.
The stronghold still presented advantages in the time of Louis XIV, and even of Napoleon. But during the 19th century, the situation gradually changed. Despite its extensive network of hornworks and bastions, Sedan lost its strategic importance as a result of advances in artillery.
It was faced with a problem that no one knew how to solve, which was a plateau that was too close, too dominant, and more dangerous. And the increase in the range of artillery throughout the 19th century made this position increasingly untenable.
In the 19th century, the garrison left signs of its presence on the castle's walls. The old fortress was restored and final modifications carried out. The 4 bastions were filled with earth to better withstand artillery fire. One of the symbols of the medieval period was quite simply destroyed, sacrificed on the altar of military efficiency.
During the 19th century, one of the main modifications involved raising the chapel around which the original castle had been built in order to stack cannonballs on the site.
Old-fashioned cannonballs that soon became obsolete, as did the entire Sedan stronghold despite its impressive size, some 20 times that of the castle today.
From the 1840s and 1850s, cannons could fire for up to 5 kilometers. This was a major first. and shells, explosive projectiles, replaced cannonballs. Prior to this, cannons fired solid spherical projectiles of cast iron. They were inert. It was the impact that destroyed walls.
When the Prussians attacked France in 1870, the landmark battle, which has gone down in history as the Battle of Sedan, actually took place outside the stronghold. With enemies' powerful shells destroying entire villages, Sedan and its castle looked on helplessly as France suffered one of the most crushing defeats in military history.
The Battle of Sedan didn't take place in Sedan, but in the surrounding villages. The stronghold hardly played a role. It took in the wounded.
Sedan became a huge infirmary and the witness of the debacle of the war and of Imperial France.
The white flag was raised on Sedan Castle at the behest of Napoleon III, who did not want more victims among his troops, and especially not among civilians. The battle tarnished the city's reputation for years, as it was associated with France's humiliating defeat.
Following this traumatic event, and after 3 years of occupation, Sedan put its days as a fortress firmly behind it.
Sedan needed modernizing and to make way for industrialization, and these huge fortified structures that had been erected all over Europe were like straitjackets. Sedan convinced the National Assembly to decommission it as a military site, which meant a large part of the fortifications around the city could be demolished.
For 4 years, Engineer Corps soldiers worked all over Sedan demolishing the huge network of bastions. At the same time, they used the old castle for their tests, and the results are still visible today.
They tested dynamite, a new explosive at the time, and in doing so completely destroyed the governor's bastion, which was ripped apart and partially destroyed the bastion Fourchu.
The castle was used as a military testing site, and they didn't give a damn about how old the fortress was.
2 disemboweled bastions as symbols of the uselessness of this type of structure. In the constant race between fortresses and artillery, Sedan Castle was now just a vestige of the past, and barely respected at that. The future of France's defenses lay elsewhere, in a new type of fort, structures designed by a military engineer, General Serré de Rivière.
The city of Sedan was not included in the Serré de Rivière plan, simply because the idea was to build new fortifications outside of the country's towns and cities.
The Serré de Rivière forts are semi-underground polygons protected by grass embankments designed to absorb impacts. They were a new development in French military engineering and a response to a new type of warfare.
In the event of war, the Serré de Rivière system provided a network of forts from north to south. In the Ardennes, there were to be 2 defensive points. At Givet, where Charles V's old fortress was reinforced, and 25 kilometers from Sedan, where a new fort was built from scratch, Fort des Évelles. Its main purpose was to protect the strategic rail junction connecting Paris to northern and eastern France.
It was very well positioned with its artillery. It could control the railroad, because at the time everything was done by rail. The roads were very poor, and the train was the ideal invention for moving troops around the country.
The construction took 3 years and involved 3,000 laborers. Once complete, the fort covered an area almost twice that of Sedan Castle.
The fort is about 6 hectares. It's an isolated one and was designed to be able to defend itself. That's why its firing line covered 360 degrees around the fort.
This means 20 cannons could be pointed in every direction. The terrain is a series of hollows and humps. In the hollows were artillery pieces, and in the humps, shelters for the gunners in the event of enemy fire.
It represents a firing line with a circumference of about 500 meters.
For close defense, it had a system of ditches, like in medieval castles, gun loops as well as apertures, not for boiling water, but for hand grenades. At a distance from the combat posts, in the middle of the fort, were the semi-underground barracks.
It's like a small town, with munition stores, kitchens. There was a bakery that could make 500 loaves a day.
The kitchens had to feed over 1,000 men, whose barrack rooms were spread over 2 floors, while 30-meter-deep wells extracted groundwater from local aquifers. And with no electricity, lighting was provided by light shafts and oil lamps. The Serre de Rivière forts looked good, but shortly after their completion, an event changed everything. A French chemist, Eugène Copin, discovered melinite.
It was a far more powerful explosive than gunpowder, and it increased the effectiveness of artillery shells. Packed with melinite, shells could penetrate the thick layers of earth, penetrate the meter-thick masonry, and explode inside the fort. And the question was put to the government at the time: what do we do now? What do we do now that everything that has just been completed is obsolete?
It would have cost a huge amount of money to put things right. So only a handful of Serre de Rivière forts were reinforced with layers of concrete and armor plating. The others were decommissioned or left as they were, like here. In August 1914, before getting bogged down in trench warfare, the German army launched its first offensive and advanced towards Paris. The powerless fort was abandoned. It never saw combat.
After destroying the artillery pieces and dousing the provisions with petrol so that the enemy could not use them, the soldiers left.
When the Germans invaded Fort-des-Évelles, Sedan had already been occupied for 4 days and would remain so for 4 years.
The First World War was a new ordeal for the inhabitants of Sedan and for the people of the Ardennes as a whole, because the Ardennes was the only department in France to be completely occupied for almost the entire duration of the war.
And yet again, Sedan Castle watched helplessly as a tragedy unfolded. But this time, the worst excesses of war occurred inside its very walls.
Towards the end of the war, the castle became a prison camp, Sedan labor camp, in which the most headstrong prisoners were held.
They were imprisoned in the Magasin Faber and in the buildings that overlook the courtyard today. Several thousand prisoners were held here in the most appalling conditions. They were subjected to daily violence, barely fed, did back-breaking work, and obviously suffered psychological distress, too. It was essentially a kind of concentration camp.
And history repeated itself. In 1940, Hitler and his generals chose to launch their blitzkrieg, or lightning war, in this corner of France. This attack has gone down in history as the Sedan Breakthrough.
The Germans carefully studied the maps, were pretty well informed, and they knew that Sedan and the surrounding area were poorly defended.
In the Ardennes, the only point capable of offering a substantial resistance was located 25 kilometers east of Sedan. The Ouvrage La Ferté, or fortress. It covers an area 3 times that of Sedan Castle, and was part of a new generation of French fortifications, which succeeded the Serre de Rivière forts, the Maginot Line.
La Ferté fortress covers about 10 hectares in all. It is surrounded by an elaborate network of obstacles, a network of anti-tank rails, and another of barbed wire.
To blend into the surroundings, the Maginot fortresses were buried deep, and unlike the Serre de Rivière forts, had no masonry.
Due to advances in artillery, strong armor was needed, and widespread use was made of reinforced concrete.
At La Ferté, Two concrete blockhouses face each other. Their construction required 6,500 cubic meters of concrete. That's the equivalent of over 900 concrete trucks. Each bunker has 2 stories.
On the upper floor, you have the combat components. In other words, steel domes, gun turrets, with their ammunition stores.
As well as a telephone exchange, bedrooms, and a water tank. On the lower floor, there are more bedrooms, generators, ventilators, and air filters. 2 stairways lead 30 meters underground to a 300-meter-long tunnel connecting the 2 combat blocks.
Only the combat blocks and shafts are made out of reinforced concrete. The tunnel is made of brick covered with render. The thinking was that the depth of the tunnel, 20 to 30 meters underground, was enough to protect it from bombardment.
In May 1940, the German army seized Sedan after a 3-day offensive. On May 16th, they reached the Ardennes' only Maginot Line fortress.
La Ferté was subjected to 4 days of particularly heavy bombing. It's estimated that some 20,000 shells were fired at it.
The fortress stood firm, but it had an Achilles heel.
The Germans clearly identified the weak spot of this type of fortification, the armor plating.
The attackers managed to plant explosives on the armor plating, and the entire French garrison perished. This was the first Maginot Line fortress to be taken by the Germans, and they let everyone know.
After the armistice was signed, the Germans organized visits here during the occupation of France. The German propaganda laid it on thick, claiming one of the Maginot Line's biggest fortresses had fallen, which was untrue. It was actually one of the smallest.
Following its tragic fate, La Ferté Fortress is now part of the Ardennes' rich military heritage. Just like the Fort des Évelles and Fort Charlemont in the north of the department. All are milestones in a history of fortifications dating back to the Middle Ages, in which old Sedan Castle is something of a miracle survivor.
It has been at the very front line of so many important wars, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II. In many ways, the fact that Sedan Castle has never been destroyed is a miracle. The fact we can still see it the way it is today is remarkable.
In 1962, when the army surrendered the monument to the municipality, the castle was on the verge of being wiped off the map due to its high maintenance costs.
Should the castle be preserved, revitalized for the future, or should it be demolished to free up land for development? The first solution was adopted.
Fortunately, the castle was not turned into a shopping mall. And 3 years later, it was even declared a historic monument. Today, it is being lovingly restored, and the old keep's water-damaged roof replaced. Yet another battle to win for this 600-year-old behemoth.